Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 274, Trees, Part 1, Over the Oak, Under the Elm. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you up a tree over this episode?
I've been up a tree for a lot of my life, just looking for the rope ladder, trying to find an easy way down.
I like it. Well, hopefully someone will help you down. Maybe a helpful fireman here and there. Well, this is episode 274 of Trifles. If you'd like the show notes for this episode, it's available at ihose.co/trifles274, all lowercase. That will bring you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site where you can poke around. You can support us as a Patreon supporter. Every supporter is automatically entered into a drawing every month for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal and for a quarterly drawing for a free year's subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So get right on that, won't you? And check it out. Well, once again, we are going to turn to a series that has become indispensable for us here on Trifles. It is Don Jewell's Sherlock Holmes Natural History series. A wonderful, 9-volume series. And we've done a lot of these with some of the exotic animals. But this time we are turning to the botanical. The Botanical Holmes was, I think, the 6th in the volume. It's a nice green cover. And it takes you through, well, everything botanical related in the Sherlock Holmes stories. But we're going to stick to just the trees this time, and some very specific trees as we get into this. Now, of course, in A Study in Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes' skills were assessed by Watson in that famous list. And what was it that Watson said about Holmes's botanical capabilities, Burt?
Oh, I think that he was particularly fond of a particular blend of botanicals in gin.
I don't blame him. I would be too. Yeah, but in terms of his ability to use or be aware of botanicals, wasn't that one of the? He was a practical but limited geologist, as we recall. But what?
Well, Watson tells us that he had, immense knowledge of poisons, but I don't recall the exact description.
Let me pull it up here, since we were attempting to go from memory. He was variable when it came to botany. Variable, well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally, knows nothing of practical gardening. Well, what kind of practical gardening would there be in the middle of London anyway? the good news is Holmes did manage to find his way out of the city from time to time. And in his earliest case, at least the earliest case he tells Watson about, the Gloria Scott, he went out to the Norfolk home of Victor Trevor, who was his only friend during his 2 years of college. And while he was there, and this is interesting because until Don Jewell mentioned it, it wasn't something that really came back to my recall of the story. But Holmes's description of the country house there includes a mention of a fine lime-lined avenue leading up to it. And Don Jewell tells us lime tree is another name for the linden. There's 3 species of lime or linden found in Great Britain. These are large shade trees with a dense pyramidal growth that frequently attains heights to up to 140 feet. And he said lindens actually do well in cities due to their tolerance to smoke. And you'd expect to find these trees lining the sidewalks of, where else? Lime Street in the city of London. But what it seems like Lime Street was named for was the lime for building that was once burnt and sold in the street. And this, of course, is where lime cream comes from. Of course, we know lime cream from Henry Baker's hat in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. Now, this is different from the citrus lime tree, which is certainly known for its accompaniment to gin, but that is a sweet lime or Citrus medica, and the products of which are imported from sunnier climates, as you could imagine.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because so much devolves from that one observation of Watson's so early in their relationship, where he remarks his knowledge of gardening, almost no knowledge of gardening. How exactly would that have come up? I mean, would they have been walking around somewhere or gone to a park, and Holmes said, "My God, Watson, what's that?" And Watson said, "Well, Holmes, it's a hedgerow. Don't you know what a hedgerow?" You know, I mean, how exactly would they have got into a conversation about gardening? You know, it's always mystified me, Watson, exactly how much peat moss one should put in a flower pot if one's transplanting one's roses. I presume roses do root, of course, in peat. I mean, how would that have come up?
Well, you know, it's interesting because in the Speckled Band, by way of dismissing Grimsby Roylott, remember Holmes said, it is a little cold for the time of year, but I hear the crocuses promise well.
Oh, right. Lovely. So clearly more evidence that not only was he not variable on common gardening, but he was apparently particularly well informed, particularly about crocuses.
Yeah, well, he was probably scanning the papers for the crocus reports that morning.
Well, I imagine the C's of his index were just full of different varieties of crocus. But here in the earliest days, we have Holmes associated with a knowledge of trees, as you've just pointed out in the Gloria Scott, this great lime-lined avenue, and oak is also just a major factor in the cases of Sherlock Holmes and the surround of this Victorian environment in which we so comfortably and happily find ourselves, because his botanical knowledge is again put to the test in the Musgrave Ritual, obviously, because he must identify an oak and an elm at Hurlston. And his description of that oak, it was one of the briefest but best in the Canon. You know, when he is telling Watson, again, this is another case where Holmes is remembering and reporting his observations after a distance of some time to Watson. And what does Holmes say? He says, right in front of the house, upon the left-hand side of the drive, there stood a patriarch among oaks, one of the most magnificent trees I have ever seen. And that is, is really, a remarkable and enthusiastic statement.
Well, clearly Watson must have taken Holmes at his word. Holmes, the individual who had only a variable knowledge of botany, according to Watson. But it made for a good setting. And there's this notion of oaks as part of England and England's history is interesting to me. And we're going to talk about exactly how the oak comes into play here, not only throughout English history, but throughout the canon as well. I wasn't aware of this. Don Jewell tells us the oak was sacred to the Druids. The mistletoe, partially parasitic upon it, was supposed to care for the tree's spirit during the winter months. And he says, who can say what happened to such spirits when the Royal Navy caused countless oak trees to be cut down for the construction of its ships? Perhaps they were responsible for England's superiority on the seas. Whatever the case, the oak has always been important to the British. And evidently, it's mentioned more frequently than any other tree or wood in all of the Sherlock Holmes adventures.
Indeed it is. And in the Reigate Squires, in the Reigate puzzle, Holmes and Watson walk along an oak-lined avenue to a fine old Queen Anne house where the Cunninghams lived. And there were oaks growing at Burlstone in the Valley of Fear, and Charlington Hall bristled out from amidst the ancient oaks in The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. And Watson commented that, old as they were, these trees were still younger than the hall itself, because oak trees could survive for 1,500 years or more. And in another case, Holmes and Watson catch up with the unfrocked clergyman Williamson and Company under the shadow of just such a mighty oak.
Yeah, and once again, when we get to the Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson describes the oaks that he observed near Baskerville Hall. He called them scrub oaks. And there were a number of trees that existed by that nickname in the United States. And Jewell tells us that these trees were either Quercus robur or Quercus petria. Victorian botanists, he said, would have lumped both species under the Quercus robur, and those reached heights of between 60 and 150 feet. And it wasn't common, but the wood frequently turned up in old buildings, and so it probably appeared in a number of the buildings that we come across in the canon.
Indeed. And as an example of that, in The Adventure of the Dancing Men, the old hall of Ridingthorpe Manor was high-windowed and oak-paneled. Von Bork's study boasted similar walls and was book-lined also in His Last Bough. Oak paneling was in place at Baskerville Hall, which was also heavily raftered with huge balks of the age-blackened wood. And Donathorpe in Gloria Scott was an old-fashioned, widespread, oak-beamed brick building. And in the Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, Cheeseman's was also held together by oaken beams.
Yeah, that's interesting. We see a number of these old buildings. Buildings seem to be dated by the condition of the oak wood in them. Stoke Moran, for example, in the Speckled Band, we saw that the brown worm-eaten oak that was so old and discolored that it may have been dated from the original building of the house. And Big Bob Ferguson in the Sussex Vampire, again, probably had similar problems when he moved the family into Cheeseman's. But he, was a handyman, so he set out to remedy the situation. And Watson described how there were areas where yellow plaster took the place of the oak in the remodeled area of the house. So, and the award, he says, for the most oak used in construction of any canonical dwelling, that's part of our Academy Awards here this evening, would go to the Abbey Grange. And the paneling there was of oak, and the mantelpiece was, and the carved ceiling, and the furniture. My gosh, Lady Brackenstall was supposed to have been tied up to an oaken chair at the head of the dining room table. And this makes a lot of sense, because oak is the hardest wood. It would have been used for the manufacture of furniture quite frequently.
Well, and also you have a thick oak door, and that appears in different points during the Canon as Holmes and Watson go to different settings at universities, travel around England, and have different engagements with people. Bob Ferguson was to discover the thickness of the oak door. Unfortunately, when his wife barred him from her bedroom in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, and at St. Luke's College in The Adventure of the Three Students, there's a similar type of door. But, it's not quite clear whether its purpose was to keep those outside out or those inside in.
It was soundproofing. I'll bet that's what it was.
Yeah, probably. And, you could say the same thing for the oak shutters in The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb.
Yeah, and because oak was so hard, we saw it used in the creation of walking sticks or cudgels. And, if you wanted to give someone a good thrashing, you grabbed your oak cudgel. Arthur Charpentier threatened Enoch Drebber with one of those in The Study in Scarlet. And that was the heavy oak stick that was the murder weapon in the cardboard box that Jim Browner carried. And the oaken walking stick that was found at the supposed scene of the crime at the Norwood Builder showed stains of blood on it. So very consistent kind of weapon there with that type of wood. You'll also see oak as popular for the manufacture of other articles as well. Some of the missing articles in the Reigate puzzle. One was a small oak thermometer. I never heard of a thermometer being made out of wood before.
You have to wait a long time to get the results.
Oh, my goodness.
But the lovely thing here, too, and this I had absolutely, no memory of, but Don Jewell tells us, for instance, oak had other uses. If oranges were out of season and difficult to obtain, a sprig of oak leaves could be substituted for the traditional orange pips, sent as a warning to a marked man. And this, of course, from the 5 orange pips.
Perfect example of a trifle there. Well, let's take a quick break hear from our sponsor, and when we come back, we will go from over the oak to under the elm. Stay with us. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. And now it's time for a little nightmare on Elm Street here. Probably the most famous elm in all of the Sherlock Holmes stories would have been the one from the Musgrave Ritual, same place where we found that patriarch of an oak. And, the elm in this case is interesting because it's the elm that did nothing in the nighttime. Holmes was looking for a tree that no longer existed. And, of course, we're familiar with, Dutch elm disease as probably one of the most well-known types of arboreal blights out there. And it is possible that the elm on Musgrave's property did succumb to such a disease. But that was certainly known back then, and it gave the elm a well-deserved bad reputation in urban areas. Branches were brittle and would break off, and the roots were shallow, so that meant that the trees would fail to anchor against some of the gales. We know of the gales that at least took on the plane tree that Watson talked about. We'll cover that in another episode. And so it's likely that elms were given that bad reputation in the city because of those very features.
Really interesting. I had no idea they were so vulnerable. With shallow roots and being prone to being blown over in the wind and being plagued by insects. And the caterpillars apparently were a great pestilential problem with elms. Don tells us that only 2 elms were commonly found in England, the wych elm and the common elm. So this Sussex tree at Musgrave Manor must have been one of these. The wych elm, he says, reached heights of over 100 feet, and the common elm could easily exceed this. And in spite of their many problems and vulnerabilities, both trees were known to live for 500 years.
Wow.
Musgrave's elm may have been chopped up and used for firewood. And he has a very interesting observation here. He says, considering what befell Brunton the butler when he attempted to solve the riddle of the ritual, I should point out that the elm was also used, a great favorite, for the construction of coffins.
Well, who knows what they eventually buried Brunton in. But the elm, of course, was not only confined to the Musgrave Ritual. We find it later on in other adventures. The yellow face, for example. Watson commented that the first faint shoots of green were breaking out upon the elms in the park. And I would assume that would be Regent's. Well, it could have been Hyde Park, rather, since it's capitalized here. The avenue leading up to Abbey Grange. The Abbey Grange was all ancient elms. And, of course, as Toby was pursuing Tonga and Jonathan Small, he pulled Holmes and Watson down 9 elms in the Sign of 4. And, again, this is one of those streets that could have been named for the trees that once grew there.
Interesting, isn't it, that you can get a sense of what the street might have looked like when you travel down a street called 9 Elms, upon which there are today no trees at all. But in the Valley of Fear, there was a row. Now, pollarding is very interesting. In the Valley of Fear, there was a row of pollarded elms on each side of the quaint Burlstone Street. Pollarding was chopping the tops of a tree off. And Don says this was quite common in British towns because it kept a tree's growth in check. And as far as the elm was concerned, it eliminated the risk of these broken branches as well.
Well, it's a fascinating look at oaks and elms, courtesy of the late Donald Gerard Jewell and his botanical homes. We will be revisiting this in a future episode. Actually, we're going to be covering the topic of trees in one way or another fairly frequently in the month of April as we continue to plow through Season 6 here of Trifles. We hope that you'll continue to join us there, and please tell other people about the show if you're enjoying this. If you think other people who like Sherlock Holmes might get something out of it, you can learn something new every day. My gosh, just like we do. We learned some things here ourselves today. And we promised you in this episode that we would be doing 2 drawings. It is our end of the month drawing for a free back issue or issues of the Baker Street Journal. So we are going to put all of our Patreon supporters, or at least their names, into the spinning drum. And we are going to just give it a big spin here. And waiting for it to go around as it comes to a stop, and we draw out number 27, and that is Diane Seekman. Diane, congratulations. We will have a back issue of the Baker Street Journal to you. And for our quarterly drawing, we do this on the quarterly episode. So this would be the end of March, the end of June, the end of September, the end of December. That's how we make our way through the quarters here. Quarter day is at hand, and that means whoever's name comes out of this drawing will have an opportunity, will actually be the recipient of a year's subscription of the Baker Street Journal. And in this case, it's number 31, and that goes to Miles Clowers. Miles, congratulations on the free year's subscription to the Baker Street Journal, which of course includes the Christmas annual. If you were not lucky enough to have been selected in this time, well, keep trying, and please don't forget to go to patreon.com/trifles or just to our homepage in the show notes, where you can become a patron as well. And look, if you don't want to support us, that's okay too. No harm, no foul. But you can subscribe to the Baker Street Journal on BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Until next time, this is the treed Scott Monty.
And I'm the perpetually tree-hugging Burt Wolf.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You're given 2 guides.
Yes, an elm and an oak.
And gentlemen, there is a patriarch among oaks.